We're going to take a look at the cell membrane, the structure, as well as the function. There are three different names for the cell membrane. One, of course, is the cell membrane. A second name is the plasma membrane. And then the third is the phospholipid bilayer. All three things meaning the same thing. Over here we have a little question. Can you see why it's called a bilayer? Bi means two. So we have two layers. And you'll notice that you've got phosphate heads here, and then phosphate heads here, and then little tails that come down and little tails that come up. So those are your two layers. We've got one layer, come over here, this is one layer, and then a second layer. That's your bilayer. The cell membrane is the gateway to the cell. In other words, the cell membrane is going to control what can go in and out of the cell. The functions of the plasma membrane, it's designed to protect the cell. It forms a boundary around the cell, and it regulates the transport of substances in and out of the cell. And this is because the cell membrane is semi-permeable, meaning it's only going to allow certain substances to pass through. And in part 2, when we're talking about the cell membrane, we'll talk about the permeability of substances, which substances are able to cross the cell membrane. Cells work to maintain homeostasis, where their internal environment is balanced with their external environment. The plasma membrane helps maintain the proper balance of materials in the cell by controlling the materials that will enter and leave the cell. The cell membrane, again, is a selective permeability, meaning it doesn't let just anything pass through. It allows for small molecules to easily move back and forth across the cell membrane. Examples of small molecules are oxygen, carbon dioxide, and lipids. Larger molecules are going to need to have help through a protein channel or a protein pump. Cells need an inside and an outside boundary separating the cell from its environment. The cell membrane acts as that boundary. But particles need to be able to move into the cell, such as different foods, sugars, proteins, and fats, as well as salts, oxygen, and water. And the materials need to be able to leave the cell, such as ammonia, salts, carbon dioxide, and water, and then proteins. There's two terms that we need to know for the cell membrane. Let me get a pen. The first term is hydrophilic, loves water. The heads, these are representing the heads. The heads are hydrophilic. They love water, and they face the watery substance. Inside the cell, there's a watery substance here, and then outside the cell, there's a watery substance here. So the heads are facing the watery substance in and outside of the cell. Again, they're hydrophilic. The second term is hydrophobic, water-fearing. If somebody has a phobia of something, meaning they're afraid of something. So the tails do not like water. And you'll notice the tails are inside. These represent the tails. And they face one another away from the watery substance. Again, your watery substance is out here, and the tails are inside away from that. Phospholipids for your cell membrane, that bilayer. The two parts for the phospholipid, the first part is the tail. The tails contain two fatty acid chains. They're nonpolar, meaning they're hydrophobic. They do not like water. Remember, water's polar, so it makes sense that the tails don't like water because they're nonpolar, hydrophobic. And then they're always facing away from the water. Remember, the tails face one another. And then the head is polar, like water, so it loves water, therefore it's hydrophilic. It's made of a phosphate group, and it always faces outwards towards the watery substance. Okay, you guys need to draw a phospholipid. Again, there's two parts to the phospholipid, the head and the tails. The head contains that phosphate group, and it's hydrophilic, meaning it loves water. And then the tails have the two fatty acid chains, and they're hydrophobic. The tails do not like water. In looking at the cell membrane, this is actually what it would look more like. Again, these are representing the heads down here, and then these are the tails. Again, we've got heads up here, and these are the tails. The tails face away from the water. The watery substance is out here and out here. The tails are on the inside because they're hydrophobic. They do not like water. The heads are on the outside, exposed to the water because they like water. They're hydrophilic. Hydrophobic molecules can pass through the cell membrane easily. Hydrophilic molecules do not pass through the cell membrane easily. The cell membrane is also known as a fluid mosaic model. It gets the fluid mosaic model the name because it's flexible and floating. The phospholipids can move side to side, kind of like if you're swaying side to side, the phospholipids can move side to side within the layer, so it's like a liquid. It allows animal cells to change shapes and move. A mosaic is a scattered pattern. It's produced by the protein molecules when the membrane is viewed from above. This is an example of a protist called a paramecium, and due to the cell membrane, it's able to move. It's flexible, which allows a unicellular organism the ability to move. When we look at the structure of the cell membrane, remember you have the fatty acid tails. Here's your fatty acid tails. They're hydrophobic, meaning they are nonpolar. They do not like water in here. You can also find cholesterol, and these green structures inside with the fatty acid tails are the cholesterol. And typically when you hear cholesterol, you think of something with somebody's health and it's bad. But cholesterol within the cell membrane's a good thing. It's very rigid, and it adds strength to the fluid mosaic model, making it more stable. Okay, remember that solubility is the ability to dissolve. This was one of the properties of water. When we look at a solution, we're looking at a substance that contains a solvent and solute. The solvent dissolves the substance, such as water. Remember, water is the universal solvent. And a solute is the part of the solution that gets dissolved. An example would be Kool-Aid, where water is our solvent and Kool-Aid powder is the solute. There's two types of transport across the cell membrane, passive and active. Passive transport moves with the concentration gradient, and it does not require ATP. Active transport moves against the concentration gradient, and it requires ATP. A concentration gradient is when you have particles that are in high concentration Notice in this diagram there's a lot of red dots on the left-hand side indicating a high concentration. They're going to naturally move without requiring energy to an area where there's fewer, in other words, a low concentration. And you'll notice on the right, there's very few little red dots. So the particles will naturally flow from an area of high concentration to an area where there's a low concentration. This is a process that occurs without energy. There's three forms of transport across the cell membrane. The first one is simple diffusion. Let me grab my pen. All right, sorry. Here you have a high concentration of particles. They're simply going to move to an area of low concentration. They're going to move across the cell membrane to where there's fewer particles. Facilitated diffusion, again, is where you have high concentration of particles and they are still going to move to an area of low concentration, but they need help. They're facilitated. They're going to have a protein that's going to help them. These are both simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion are both passive transport, meaning they do not require energy because they're going down the concentration gradient. The third one is an active transport. Active transport is going to require energy, and that energy is in the form of ATP. This is because the particles are now going to move against the concentration gradient. They're going from low concentration to a high concentration. Notice there's way more purple particles down here. That's what's known as against the concentration gradient. Let's first look at passive transport. Again, passive transport does not require energy, therefore no ATP is needed. Substances are going to flow down the concentration gradient, meaning from a high concentrated area to a low concentrated area. There are three types of passive transport: osmosis, which is a diffusion of water particles, diffusion, and then facilitated diffusion, which is when you have large particles that are going to need protein channels to help move the substances across the gradient. Passive transport, again, looking at specific examples. Simple diffusion doesn't require energy. It moves from a high concentration area to a low concentration. An example is oxygen or water diffusing into a cell and carbon dioxide diffusing out of a cell. In the diagram, you're looking at simple diffusion. Let me grab my pen. This is where you have your high concentration. The particles are going to move across the cell membrane to a low concentration area. The concentration gradient would be your cell membrane or your lipid bilayer. Simple diffusion, again, high concentration to low concentration. If these were representing smells, you could say that somebody, was spraying an air freshener down here in the corner, and then gradually the particles would move out, and then somebody over here could eventually smell it. You can have diffusion of liquids. Food coloring going into water is a good example, where you're looking at a concentration of the color. When you first put the drops of food coloring into the water, you gradually see those drops spread out. They're diffusing more and more here, and then eventually they've diffused evenly throughout the water. Osmosis is diffusion of water. This is when water molecules are moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Diffusion of water across a membrane. On the left-hand side, I have high water concentration and a low solute concentration. Remember, solute is the particle that's dissolved in water. And then on the right-hand side, I have a low water concentration, but a high solute concentration. So the water wants to diffuse from an area of high concentration, the left, across the cell membrane to the right to lower that solute concentration. It wants to have more water particles on the right-hand side.